Well, I got some great news today. Got my DNA results back. Turns out I'm 100% Himalayan. Yeah, good morning. It's Uncle Lou here. That's right. It is me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. Clemson versus LSU, Ohio State versus Texas. Two huge week one matchups. Week one is absolutely loaded with great games. We've got 5 days of games: Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. These two are on Saturday. Both these games are on Saturday, August 30th. We've got one at night and one at noon, right? Ohio State and Texas, of course, big noon kickoff. A lot of Ohio State fans are upset with that. It does seem like every Ohio State game gets put on at noon. I don't really blame them for being upset about that. And then we've got LSU and Clemson at night. Now, this is a matchup of 4 top 10 teams, and almost every single ranking you look at, Ohio State and Texas for sure are in the top 10 of every poll, top 5 of most poll, 1 and 2 in the coaches poll. But however you want to judge these teams here, LSU and Clemson in the top 5, in some cases top 10 in almost every case. It's just two huge matchups here in week 1 of college football, and a lot has been said and talked about these games already during the offseason, and of course in the week leading up to the game. I'll have full breakdowns and predictions for each of the games, but I want to talk today about these two games in terms of which of these 4 teams needs to win this game the most. Now, this isn't a terminal game or a season-ending game, no matter who wins or loses, right? We all understand in the world of the 12-team playoff where conference champions are guaranteed a spot somewhere in that 12-team field, that no matter who wins or loses these two games, the losing team could go on to win their conference and automatically make the playoffs, right? And in the case of Clemson, for example, that's likely. Like they are a prohibitive favorite to win the ACC. For LSU and Texas and Ohio State, 2 SEC teams and a Big Ten team, I think there are more legitimate contenders at the top of those 2 leagues than there are in the ACC. That's not a guarantee that Clemson will win the ACC, but Clemson is a much bigger favorite to win the ACC than any team is to win either the SEC or the Big Ten because of the perceived sort of elite teams at the top of both the SEC and the Big Ten compared to what you have in the ACC. Again, I'm talking about perception. We don't know how the season's going to play out. Maybe the ACC ends up with 3 or 4 elite teams, but the perception heading in is that you've got Clemson in the ACC and then kind of several teams fighting to be the team that gets to play Clemson in the ACC championship game. Again, for the 100th time, that doesn't mean that Clemson will end up in the ACC championship. I'm talking about the odds and the perception heading into the season, right? Miami, Louisville, Georgia Tech, SMU. Who's it going to be that gets an opportunity to play Clemson in the ACC championship game? That's how it feels heading into the start of the season. Of course, lots can change over the course of the season. You look at the SEC, Texas is the favorite to win the SEC, right? But right behind them is Georgia. Right behind them is Alabama. You've got LSU right in the mix too. And the same thing when you look at the Big Ten. Ohio State, while they're the favorite, you've got Penn State, you've got Oregon, you've got Michigan, you've got several teams at the top of both the SEC and the Big Ten that I think have legitimate chances of making it to or winning their conference championship games, whereas Clemson feels like a little bit more of a sure thing, even though I know there is no such thing as a sure thing. So when I look at these two games and I say, okay, who needs this win the most? I kind of eliminate Clemson from the equation. Clemson could lose this game to LSU by 2 or 3 touchdowns. And while that would be a bad loss, particularly with it being at home for Clemson, Clemson currently has a 3-game losing streak to the SEC. So talked about perception a minute ago. If Clemson were to drop this game to LSU, that would further the perception that as good as Clemson is, they're clearly behind sort of the SEC, right? Because they would have lost, that would be their 4th straight game to the SEC. They lost to Georgia to kick off the season last year. They lost to South Carolina at the end of the regular season last year. And then they lost to Texas in the playoffs. So the 3 straight losses there for Clemson. So maybe from a perception point of view, it's important for Clemson to get a win, momentum, confidence, things like that to propel them forward into the season. But I don't think it's as important for Clemson to win the game as it would be either of the other three, because Clemson is in the ACC. And even if they lose this game by 2 or 3 touchdowns, I think they would still be considered a significant favorite in the ACC. So I'm going to sort of eliminate Clemson from the conversation as the team that needs this win the most. Let's look now at the Ohio State-Texas game. Ohio State just won the national championship. Now, it wasn't a perfect season. They, of course, lost to Michigan, which still leaves a little bit of a bad taste in the Ohio State fans' mouth. You always want to win your rivalry game, and they lost to Oregon earlier in the season. Now, they were able to avenge that loss to Oregon with a playoff win over Oregon in the Rose Bowl, a convincing win. Ohio State went on a generational run in the playoffs. They were absolutely amazing in the playoffs. They would have destroyed anybody they played. That was pretty evident and clear by the way they were playing once they got into the playoffs. But because they won the national title last season, and because this is a non-conference game, and because they literally just beat Texas in last year's playoffs on the way to winning that national title, I don't think Ohio State is the team that needs this win the most. Now, in previous years, I would have looked at that a little bit differently. We talked about the losing streak that Clemson currently has to the SEC. Before last season, where Ryan Day beat 2 SEC teams, right? They beat Tennessee and Texas in the playoffs. Prior to that, Ryan Day had really struggled against the SEC, and Ohio State in general has struggled against the SEC in the college football postseason, really going back to the beginning of time. Ohio State was something like 2-13, I think, against the SEC in postseason play all time, and they got 2 wins against the SEC last year, so they doubled their win total all time against the SEC in the postseason last year. But because they beat 2 SEC teams last year, because they won the national title, it feels like, I don't think Ohio State is the team out of these 4 that needs this win the most, right? They built up a lot of credibility last season. Hell, we saw them win a national title last season while losing 2 games in the regular season. So while losing this game again at home for Ohio State might be embarrassing, and obviously you don't ever want to lose any game, particularly a big game. And even though this is a week 1 game, this is a big game. It's a massive game. Texas and Ohio State are 2 of the biggest brands in college football, not just today, but all time in the world of college football. So it's a big game, and clearly it would hurt to lose the game. But I don't think Ohio State needs this win the most. So I'm going to eliminate Ohio State from this conversation too, mainly because they just won the national title. They've got enough credibility built up for right now. So that leaves Texas and LSU. Who needs this win the most? Is it Texas? Is it LSU? Let's start with Texas. Texas has had a couple of really good seasons in a row under Sarkisian. Last year was their first year in the SEC. They made the SEC championship game, coming up a little bit short against Georgia. They won a playoff game against Arizona State. They did come up short against Ohio State, like we mentioned, but Ohio State went on to win the national title. So not an embarrassing loss, not the way Texas fans wanted the season to end, but not an embarrassing loss to lose to Ohio State last year, knowing what we know now, that they went on to win the national title. When you look at Texas' chances to make the playoffs this year, I think they're pretty good. They've got a favorable schedule in the SEC relative to some of the other teams in the SEC that may be competing for playoff spots or a spot in the SEC championship game. They do play Texas A&M, which could be tricky at the end of the year, although they get them at home. They have a road game at Florida, which some people think could be a potential trap or slip up type situation for Texas. But, they have to go on the road and play Georgia. But they don't play LSU. They don't play Tennessee. They don't play Ole Miss. They do play Oklahoma. So they've got some landmines sprinkled throughout the year. But whether you're talking odds to win the SEC, odds to make the playoffs, odds to win the national title, they are higher on all of those lists than LSU is for a reason, I think. They're ranked higher in almost every ranking than LSU is. It feels like Texas, if they lose this game, still has a pretty good shot at making the playoffs, even if they don't win the SEC. It's hard to find 3 losses on this Texas schedule. And 10-2 is not only going to almost guarantee them a spot in the college football playoff, but if one of those losses is to Ohio State and they finish 10-2, they're probably still going to be in the SEC championship game with only one conference loss if they go 10-2. And if last year is any indication of what will happen going forward, the loser of the SEC championship game is still going to get into the playoffs. Same with the Big Ten, we think, right? So I don't know if it's Texas that needs this win the most. What about LSU? Well, the perception from LSU may be the worst of any of the three in terms of some of these trends that we talked about. Ohio State had a sort of perception issue against the SEC that they solved last year by beating a couple of high-level SEC teams. Clemson has a 3-game losing streak to the SEC. That's true, but that only encompasses one season. So even the 3-game losing streak that Clemson has, it's not something that people have been talking about for years. It's literally just a streak from last season where they happen to play 3 SEC teams. LSU, on the other hand, has not won a Week 1 game since 2019, pre-COVID. That was the year, of course, the Joe Burrow year where they went on to win the national title. One of the best LSU teams, probably the best LSU team of all time. One of the best college football teams of the last 25 years. They, of course, were undefeated that season. But in 2020, the COVID year, when we only played conference schedules, they lost their first game of the year to an SEC team. And they have lost a non-con game 4 years in a row since then, 21, 22, 23, and 24. So they have lost their Week 1 game now for 5 straight years. So it's a longer loss streak there, 5, than Clemson's SEC streak, which stands at 3. And in terms of how long this streak has gone on, again, it's 5 years in a row, whereas the Clemson streak only encompasses the one season last season. So I think from a perception standpoint, why can't LSU win their first game of the year? And this is something that goes back to the previous coach. It's not just a Brian Kelly issue, right? Brian Kelly's got some issues, and this is one of them. But this isn't just a Brian Kelly issue. It's an LSU. This goes back to Ed Orgeron. Ed Orgeron lost the opening game in 20. Ed Orgeron lost the opening game in 21. Then Brian Kelly comes in, loses the opening game in 22, the opening game in 23, the opening game in 24. Now here you are, 2025, and you got to go on the road and play what most people think is a top 5 team in the Clemson Tigers, kind of a battle of the Death Valley situation there. 2 really great quarterbacks in this game. I think Garrett Nussmeier for LSU and Cade Klubnik for Clemson. A lot of times in these Week 1 games, you see offenses that are a little bit slow kind of to get going early in the season, and defenses kind of rule the day. With these 2 quarterbacks and the talent they have around them and the experience that they have and how well they played last year, I wouldn't be surprised at all if both of these offenses show up kind of clicking on all cylinders right out of the gate. But it feels like LSU needs to win this game more than any of these other teams need to win. The perception issue being an obvious reason there. Why can't they win a Week 1 game? You can kind of scratch that off your list if they manage to go on the road and beat a really good Clemson team. But besides that, we talked about what happens to Texas if they lose to Ohio State and what that means for the rest of their season in terms of their SEC schedule, their ability to make the SEC championship game or potentially the playoffs. What about with LSU? I think LSU's got a more difficult road to the playoffs than Texas does if they start this thing 0-1. It's a non-conference game, and it just like the Texas game is, and that's important to sort of differentiate that because there are 2 paths to the playoffs, right? One is win your conference. The other is to get in as an at-large. Well, to get in as an at-large, that's where the losses really matter the most. You can win your conference and lose every conference game you play and still get into the playoffs in LSU's case, 8-4. They could go 0-4 in the non-con. Now, they won't. You look at their other non-con opponents outside of Clemson, they're not losing any of those. But just in theory, any team could go winless in the non-con, win their conference championship game, and they're still going to be in the playoffs, right? But what if that doesn't happen for LSU? Okay, just play this scenario out. What if LSU doesn't even make the SEC conference championship game? And there are plenty of people who are predicting that they will, but they've only made it once under Brian Kelly. That was in their first year, and they lost to Georgia in 22, I guess that was. So they've only made it once. What if they don't make the SEC championship game? And they have lost this game to Clemson at the beginning of the year, that means they probably lost at least 2 conference games, right? We're assuming they don't get into the SEC championship game, right? Well, that means they probably lost 2 conference games. We're assuming right now a loss to Clemson. That would put them at 3 losses minimum. And if last year, again, is any indication, a 9-3 team is not likely to get in over any 11-1 teams from any of the major conferences, right? And that's if they go 9-3. They could, if they lose to Clemson, 8-4 becomes a possibility. Again, you look at LSU's schedule. They got to play. Florida. They got to play Alabama. They got to play Ole Miss. They've got landmines like everybody does, strewn throughout this season. I think Texas is likely to make the SEC championship game, even if they lose to Ohio State. Whereas I look at LSU and I go, if they lose to Clemson, they're probably losing a couple more games too, right? Now, on the other hand, if they go out and beat Clemson by a couple of scores, everybody might be recalibrating and going, whoa, LSU might be the favorite to win the SEC this year. We'll see. A lot of overreactions early in the year, but if LSU were to go out and dominate on the road at Clemson, I do think that would make what a lot of people, I think that would change a lot of people's minds in terms of how they feel about LSU. I think LSU needs this win the most. It would get the monkey off their back about the week 1 losses and why do you keep losing week 1 games and you haven't won a week 1 game since 2019. You lost 5 week 1 games in a row. All that stuff that you hear over and over and over and over and over again. Everybody talks about LSU. It would obviously check that box, get rid of that. But if they beat Clemson, then that gives them still, I think, 2 chances to make the playoffs. They could go on to make the SEC championship game, potentially win it and guarantee a spot. Even if they get to the SEC championship game and lose it, they're still likely to get in. And if they have beaten Clemson but don't make the SEC championship game, then maybe they're 10-2, just on the outside of the SEC championship game, but still most likely getting in as with an at-large bid at 10-2. So of these 4 teams involved in these 2 games, and these are both massive games, and again, no matter who wins or loses these games, all 4 of these teams are still going to have a good shot at the playoffs coming out of week 1, barring some kind of crazy injury where half somebody's offense gets hurt in week 1 or something like that. But, I'm assuming both of these games are going to be relatively close, 10-point or less wins either way. If that's the case, all 4 of these teams are still going to have significant shots at the playoffs, regardless of whether they win or lose. But I do feel like LSU is the team of these 4 that needs the win the most. How do y'all feel about it? Is there a team here that you feel like needs to win this game for one reason or another, either something I've already talked about or maybe a different reason altogether? Which team of these 4 do you feel like needs the win the most? I feel like it's LSU for all the reasons I've talked about. Now, I've done preseason prediction videos game by game for all 4 of these teams involved here. And so just for transparency's sake, I have picked Clemson to win a close one at home against LSU. And I said, look, if this game was in LSU, I'd pick LSU. If it's at Clemson, I'll pick Clemson. I think it's going to be a great game. Could go either way. I'm just leaning slightly towards the home team. Clemson's a 3.5-point favorite right now, depending on where you look. In the Texas-Ohio State game, it's actually harder for me to pick. I think I'm more confident in Clemson winning it against LSU at home than I am Ohio State winning against Texas at home for a couple of reasons. And again, I'll get into these games in a lot more detail in the week leading up to the games and break the games down and give you full thoughts and all that. But Ohio State having won the national title last year, it's kind of human nature, I think, to maybe take your foot off the gas a little bit in the offseason. In February and March, do you really feel like getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning and putting that extra time in the weight room or on the track or on the practice field or whatever it is when you're just coming off a national title? I don't know. Maybe we have seen some teams go back to back. Georgia did it recently. Bama did it once in the 2010s. Southern Cal, I believe, did it in the 2000s. So it does happen sometimes. But it's very rare. Very rare. I've actually got Texas upsetting Ohio State on the road in week 1. It feels like Texas is kind of the team out with something to prove this year, which was Ohio State last year. Oh, remember last year, everybody talked about Ohio State in the offseason, and this is their year. And if they're not going to win it now, when are they going to win it? And blah, 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 all that, right? Well, Ohio State went out and won it. It feels like people are talking about Texas a lot like they talked about Ohio State. Now, that doesn't mean I'm picking Texas to win the Natty, But in this particular game, you got two new quarterbacks here. Arch Manning for Texas, Julian Sayin for Ohio State. Arch Manning's got a lot more playing experience than Julian Sayin does. That kind of plays into it for me a little bit. I've got Texas with a small upset on the road at Ohio State. But again, that game could go either way. I'm not here to dump on Ohio State. They're going to be one of the best teams in the country again, and I'll be shocked if they're not in the playoffs again. So Ohio State fans, I don't want to get upset with me. Just you got to make some picks sometimes, and tough games are hard to pick, and this is one of them. But I am going with Texas on the road and Clemson at home. All right, who needs this win the most? Let me know down below. Have a good morning.